Hello, I'm Jheni Osman. I'm a science journalist and the author of the book Conceivable. Over the next 10-15 minutes or so, I'm just going to chat a little bit about female fertility in relation to IVF. Just to give you an idea of my story, my background. So yes, I'm a science journalist, but I actually went through 2 rounds of IVF. The first round we were very lucky, it was successful, we had our first child. And then we actually had a failed second attempt, but then with a frozen embryo, we managed to have our second child, and just feel incredibly lucky because I suffer from a low ovarian reserve, which basically means my odds were very, very low. And I think it's this feeling of having been incredibly lucky to have our kids that spurred me to write the book. And it's sort of a step-by-step how-to guide, how to go through the process, what it involves, gives loads of advice from everyone from consultants to counsellors, patient quotes, and so it's been sort of a handbook to the process, because I know when I went through it, there was lots of information from clinics, from different websites, well-meaning blogs. It was just a huge amount of information to take on board. And so I wanted to, as a science journalist as well, I wanted to look at the science behind it all and what the science says was worth investing in and what wasn't. And so that's from this, I then wanted to kind of pick out just a few things to chat about today, which I think could hopefully be useful if you're interested from a fertility perspective. I'm going to look at female fertility, but my book does also cover a bit about male fertility. Just going to screen share, because then I can just show you a few graphs, etc., etc. So yes, first thing I want to chat about is what to be aware of if you want to have kids. Well, age is a huge factor, particularly for women, sadly. And in many countries around the world, there's a real trend, isn't there, towards older mothers. We're very lucky, increased standard of education, more opportunities for working women, etc. Does mean that we're often having kids later in life. And normally female fertility sort of decreases gradually through our 20s and slowing down around the age of 32, this is on average, and then starts to more rapidly decline from 37. Basically, it's because your eggs are more robust at a younger age. Now, it's going to sound a bit silly, but before starting IVF and before finding out about my fertility, I didn't actually realise that female fertility declines at quite such a young age on average. I remember saying this to one of my friends, and she said, well, Jen, that's ridiculous. You sat through, we studied biology together, you sat through a lot of lectures next to me. Maybe I just wasn't concentrating at that time. But I think in my early 30s, I had other things on my mind, and I sort of just wasn't really necessarily focused on having kids. And I know that, I'm not alone. I've looked into this, and one study said that a number of university students, when they interviewed them, they actually weren't aware, sort of half of them weren't aware of the age at which fertility can start to decrease. I'll show you a couple of graphs that I picked out for the book, which show, yes, how age affects fertility. So one is a graph from the ACOG, which was published back in 2014, on the left there, that looks at how fertility declines in women according to age. And the other graph is from the HFEA, and it looks at birth rates per embryo transferred if someone's going through IVF, and how successful it is according to age. So I just think those are quite interesting. It really makes the point, doesn't it? And I know that the HFEA have said, they are the government's independent regulator that sort of oversees fertility treatment and research, and they've said that 95% of women aged 35 and under who have regular sex will get pregnant within 3 years of trying, but by the age of 38, that goes down to sort of 75%. So it just goes to show what an important factor age is. Another factor that's worth considering is your menstrual cycle. Now, ovulation is when an egg is released from the ovaries. You'll know that if you see some sort of clear white mucousy stuff, it looks a bit like runny egg white. And after you've released an egg, it survives for about 12 to 24 hours. And so has to be fertilized by the sperm within this window. Now, sperm can live inside you for about around 5 days, I think it is. And I know that for the NHS says that for women with regular periods, ovulation happens sort of between 10 to 16 around 10 to 16 days before your next period. That's if you've got regular periods. And so but most consultants and GPs that I chatted to said, it's probably worth having sex every 2 to 3 days just to try to maximize your chances, and particularly if you have irregular periods, it's worth thinking about that. Also balancing that with not feeling under too much pressure to constantly be having sex, because that can affect everything from your relationship to your well-being and so on, in terms of the stress and the pressure of trying to get pregnant. We've all been there. know exactly what it's like. Another thing that you probably need to be aware of if you're trying for kids is potential infections. Now, none of us want to think that we might have a sexually transmitted infection, such as chlamydia, gonorrhea, mycoplasma. But for example, with chlamydia, actually, it's more common than people realise. They often don't show any symptoms, and it can cause infertility, as can the other two. Antibiotics can be used to treat it, so it's not something to worry about hugely, but that's something you will be tested for if you start going down the IVF treatment, the fertility treatment route. And then finally, well, it's not finally because it's a huge area, but lifestyle. All sorts of things can have a detrimental effect in terms of what you're doing with your life and how you live your life. Smoking is a classic one that is a real no-no. It drastically reduces your chances of getting pregnant. The NHS actually won't fund anyone for IVF if they smoke. Even if you don't smoke, but your partner does, your chances are lower as you're exposed to secondary smoke in the air. A Dutch study back in 2005 found that smoking actually adds about 10 years to a woman's reproductive age. That's for a 20-year-old. And it can, another study found that it can affect your menopause and bring it forward by about 4 years. And then if you're going through IVF treatment, it could be twice as likely to, smokers probably need twice as many cycles, than non-smokers. So something to bear in mind. And research is still out there actually about vaping, so you might be using that as a substitute if you're normally a smoker. And just early research suggests it might not be a great idea for fertility either, so just something else to bear in mind. Alcohol, we all need to drink sometimes, particularly if you're going through a slightly stressful period. But just something to bear in mind that different pieces of research have actually shown that moderate amounts of alcohol actually do affect fertility. Science behind it isn't quite known yet. It may be that it affects hormones levels, maybe the egg matures slightly abnormally, or the endometrium isn't as receptive to implantation from the embryo. So it's worth bearing in mind that's the advice, just to avoid smoking and avoid drinking too much if possible. Other things that are often discussed in terms of things that you could affect you getting pregnant, diet. Now there are all sorts of books out there on diet and fertility and what to eat when. Most people that I spoke to, experts or research I looked at, suggested a Mediterranean diet, so lots of oily fish, veg, cut down on the red meat. And one particular book that a number of experts recommended is by a couple of Harvard professors, the University of Harvard. It's called The Fertility Diet by Chavarro and Willett, I think it is. So maybe worth taking a look at that. And then finally, exercise. Hey, it's good to keep doing things as normally as possible. If you normally exercise and you enjoy exercising, then very much do that. The key thing is don't over exercise. It can really affect your fertility, and I know a number of friends who've become pregnant, and when they went through IVF, they had a couple of failed cycles, and then they actually got pregnant once they dropped the amount of exercising they were doing. So you don't want to under exercise, because you want to keep your body fit and healthy, but you don't want to over exercise. Also, something to bear in mind is weight. I know that in the NHS funds, I think in Scotland, your BMI, your body mass index, needs to be, I think it's between 18.5 and 30, and in England it's 19 and 30, in order to qualify, just because they found that weight actually affects egg quality and so on, and how easily you get pregnant. So these are all things to consider. When should you start thinking or being concerned as a woman about your fertility? Well, everyone's fertility varies. If you get pregnant naturally in their 40s, are very lucky. People like me may lose fertility slightly younger age or start to decline. It's just worth bearing in mind that eggs are of higher quality when you're younger. Experts at the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists say that the best time is probably if you're going to freeze eggs in your 20s, but don't panic if you're past that age, because plenty of people get pregnant by freezing eggs much older. And a bit of research shows that women freezing their eggs before they turn 35 actually have higher chances of conceiving than people who don't freeze their eggs and then try to conceive naturally when they're older. So not something to be concerned about, but just something to think about, keeping back in your mind. And when should you think about getting investigated if you're struggling to conceive? I would say the general advice is start chatting to your GP if you've been trying for over a year. Go and discuss with them. They may have suggestions, things you can do to hopefully increase your chances. But if you still don't have any success after 2 years, then your first port of call should be go and chat to your GP, and then they will refer you on to a clinic. And if you're a woman, I think it's over 36 or 36 and over, or a man 40 and over, they'll refer you on quicker than the 2-year mark. So you'll then, be put into the process of discussing potentially if you need fertility treatment. I'm just going to, this is from my book, quite a useful timeline to just give you an overview. I don't know if you can see that. Let's see, it's sort of overlapping, isn't it? There we go, with where my head is on the video. But yes, you can see the various steps. This is a real condensed version of what the average IVF process would be like for an average heterosexual couple. Can be very different to this for different people. You might not need to take egg boosting drugs, you might not do, but anyway, this kind of just gives you a bit of an overview, and I go into a lot more detail in it in the book. And so finally, I'll just sort of finish by talking a little bit more about the book, what I cover in it. So like I said, I go through, I discuss all sorts of reasons why you might not be able to conceive. We've discussed a few just then, but it goes into a lot more depth in that way. Looks at male fertility as well. I look at the IVF process, literally step by step, of what it involves, questions you might need to ask your consultant, when you might need to consider talking to counsellors, all the, you know, the huge myriad of things that you might come up against. Hopefully it's a real helpful sort of here's how you go through it guide, in that sense. Other chapters talk about how to choose a clinic that will suit you, what to consider, things like costs, location, services offered, etc., etc. You may have heard people talk about these things called add-ons, and yes, I look at the science behind, you know, what's worth, what research has found, which add-ons are worth investing in and which aren't, and I go into that in quite a lot of depth, along with treatment abroad, looking at that. Other chapters discuss donation of eggs, embryo, sperm, and the legal issues associated with that. Same with freezing, cryopreserving eggs, embryos, sperm. Sixth chapter looks at when IVF doesn't work. I had that experience. It was pretty devastating the second time round when it didn't work for me. I already had a child, but it was still an upsetting experience. And for some people, very, very sadly, IVF just never works. And so from talking to patients who that was the case for them, and how they've dealt with the grief and moved on over the years and found happiness afterwards, that's quite an important chapter, I think, with helping people deal with rounds that don't work, but also when it doesn't work at all. And then finally, the final chapter, it looks at what's next, you know, in terms of the future of IVF treatments and what's around the corner, and so on. So I think hopefully it's a really useful how-to guide. There's advice from experts, everyone from consultants through to counsellors, and lots of patient quotes to give you a real inside view into what this hugely overwhelming IVF world is. It also gives loads and loads of sources, from the HFEH, How to Choose a Clinic website, through to all sorts of charities, Donor Conception Network, etc., etc. So there's a real, hopefully a real useful bundle of sources there. And I'd really recommend you looking at the Total Fertility website as well. It's really, really good. So browsing through that in depth. And finally, I'll just sort of finish by saying, you know, these are some quotes from people who went through who've gone through IVF treatment themselves. For some it's worked, for some it hasn't. And I would just say, you know, going through fertility treatment is a really difficult journey. It can be a really difficult journey. You know, quite confusing, lots of challenges, huge swings of emotion, huge financial outlay often. You know, if you are starting on that journey, it's a tough challenge, and well done you for taking it on. And I just say, sort of, be really kind to yourself, give yourself a break. You know, look after yourself and hang on in there, and good luck. You know, I wish you the very, very best with whatever journey you go through. So, and finally, I'll just say thank you. It's thank you to Total Fertility for letting me discuss and share this, and yeah, I wish you all the very best for going through IVF and on your fertility journey.